Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Before we start, just a announcement that next week, Wednesday, we will not be having class. That's the Wednesday right before Thanksgiving, and that's one of the times when my kids have off, and so I like to take that day off as well as Thanksgiving to be able to have a little more time with the family. So sorry, you're just going to have to study on your own. But for today, we're going to talk about a different type of family dynamic, one that's not exactly healthy and pretty and good. We're going to be looking at the exchange between Lavan and Yaakov, between Laban and Jacob. And it isn't pretty. So let's do a little recap because we're going to get to the end of their relationship. And I want to make sure that we know how it all began. Jacob, as we all know, decided it was better to leave town when his brother was so angry after the deception regarding the birth, the blessing of being the firstborn. And so he is heading to Haran. He gets the famous vision of the ladder with the angels, and he knows he's going to be helped, but he doesn't know exactly how this is going to work. He gets up to Haran, to his ancestor's home, and there he meets Lavan, who we saw when Rebecca, his mom, was living at home in the previous parsha, and very jaunty too. And he shows up, unlike Eliezer, who came with all the gems and gold and everything. He shows up penniless. And Lavan is like, all right, well, if you want to marry my daughter Rachel, you're going to have to work for it, right? So he works 7 years, and then he ends up marrying Leah, which doesn't make Jacob too happy. And so Lavan says, oh, but that's just the way we do things around here. You're going to have to wait a week and do the wedding celebrations, and then you can marry the other as long as you promise to work an additional 7 years. And so he does the week, marries Rachel 7 days later, and now he's got 2 wives and another 7 years on the clock. So far, so good. Babies start coming. We end up...
I'm sorry. You didn't mention that that's his uncle.
No.
I mean,
yeah, but this is family.
Yeah.
Well, he wouldn't have treated someone so generously if he hadn't been family. And
the closeness of family.
Exactly. No one can cheat you quite like a family member can cheat you. And then he works the 7 years, and now he's like, okay, I worked for 7 years to get one. I worked for another 7 years to get the other. If I'm still working, aren't I supposed to be getting paid? Otherwise, I think we call that slavery. And so they set up this deal for sheep. And again, Lavan is clearly trying to manipulate and exploit Jacob. But Jacob, thankfully, has a lot more knowledge of sheep and the support of God. And Jacob is able to amass a great fortune. But that means, because of the way breeding works, that as the baby sheep are coming to his flock, those baby sheep are not going to Lavan's flock, which means the sheep that are birthing them are not being replaced at the same rate, which means Lavan's flock shrinks, Jacob's flock grows. Working on my speech impediment this morning. So Jacob begins to see the sharpening of knives as Lavan's other children are getting more and more jealous of his growing wealth and the dwindling of their father's inheritance, his wealth. And so Jacob decides once again that discretion is the better part of valor and runs. We all caught up to the story? Yeah. Good, because now Lavan is hot on the trail. And we're going to pick up at that point. We're on page 182 in the Vayeitzei, which is chapter 31, and we'll be picking up on page verse 22. So verse 22. So we're on page 182, which is chapter 31 from the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, and we'll be beginning our reading on verse 22. All right. Is my volunteer ready?
On the third day, Lavan was told that Jacob had fled. So he took his kinsman with him and pursued him a distance of 7 days, catching up with him in the hill country of Gilead.
Which must have been incredibly frustrating for Jacob, because this hill country is right on the border for the land of Canaan, right? He's caught him just before he got across the river. So it's almost there. And this is, like the posse is chasing down Jacob. We got the tension here? Good.
But God appeared to Lavan, the Aramean, in a dream by night and said to him, beware of attempting anything with Jacob, good or bad.
Okay. It's a little odd, a little awkward, because why should we not want him to do anything good? We understand God saying, lay off Jacob, don't do anything bad, but don't do anything good. You know, what if Lavan was just chasing him down to give him a going away present? Yeah, we know that that's not what he's planning to do, but why tell Lavan, don't do anything good for Jacob?
Because God wants Jacob to recognize it's all God.
All right, so one might be that there could be a misattribution, that if Jacob feels somehow
Laban has helped him out, and it's not from the hand of God.
Then maybe not all of his success he owes to God.
He won't teach his children that trust and that reliance.
Possibly, although, to push back, every success comes with a mixture of other people's participation. No one ever succeeds simply by sitting in the corner and praying hard to God, and then all of a sudden the life they want appears out of nothing. That's just impossible. I mean, not even lottery winners do it on their own, right? Someone else had to put the money in the lottery, and someone else had to set up the whole lottery system. You can't give all the credit to just God in some weird, detached, divine sense. So there's always going to be good from other people mixed with the good that God has done. In fact, that's usually what we say, is that other people are the vehicle for God doing good for us. After all, God gave him sheep from Lavan's sheep. And that is something that is good. And God in general is more worried about us not relying on other people, but more worried about us thinking we only rely on ourselves. It's that self-arrogance that God warns us about many, many times in the Torah. So maybe partly, but I don't know if that explains the fullness of God's.
Was he worried that maybe if he was to give him a present or something, he couldn't resist trying to kick him or something, or they get in an argument?
That if he tried to do something good or bad or good, that it still might spark a conflict. And definitely any engagement, except we're going to find out that Lavan is going to engage. And he's going to try and do stuff.
If someone's chasing you down, they're not looking to do good for you.
It is rare to have a person chasing you to return your wallet. It does happen, but oftentimes.
In this case, if he was to do anything good, I think Jacob should have been very leery. Because this man was coming at him angry.
So you mean
he wasn't coming to tell him goodbye.
So you mean that beware of Greeks bearing gifts.
Yes.
That the person who you presume is your enemy, if they show up trying to do something nice, double check to make sure it's not a ticking bomb.
But there's
the Trojan horse.
There's a whole other element where Jacob is taking not just his wealth, but he's taking his family and his children and his grandchildren. You know, it's a huge desertion in a sense.
Absolutely.
So must have been a very conflicted Laban. You know, it's that whole element of playing a trick, and this one's playing another trick, and they're doing mind games constantly against each other, and then it's a devastation of losing. What was it? She had to run back and get the household gods.
We're getting there.
Oh,
okay, so let's go ahead and find out what happens with the encounter now that we've had God somewhat set the parameters, which we will come back to in our commentary.
Lavan overtook Jacob. Jacob had pitched his tent on the height, and Lavan, with his kinsmen, encamped in the hill country of Gilead. And Lavan said to Jacob, "What did you mean by keeping me in the dark and carrying off my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee in secrecy and mislead me and not tell me? I would have sent you off with festive music, with timbrel and lyre. You did not even let me kiss my sons and daughters goodbye. It was a foolish thing for you to do. I have it in my power to do you harm, but the God of your father said to me last night, beware of attempting anything with Jacob, good or bad. Very well. You had to leave because you were longing for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?"
All right, so first of all, let's deal with his first speech. which is basically, you hurt my heart, right? You show up here on the day of my daughter's wedding, right? It's the Godfather speech. I could crush you, and you've humiliated me. You've embarrassed me. All I wanted to do was kiss my sons and daughters goodbye, which, by the way, means that he's talking about his grandchildren. Why would you do this to me? When, in fact, there's definitely a veiled threat under all of that. And we know duplicity, because there did not seem to be any intention that Lavan was ever going to let Jacob leave with what he had. And certainly his own daughters did not believe that they needed time to say goodbye to Papa, which shows you the state of the family relationship. But what is this about the gods, right? What is this about the gods? And we know that Rachel took some of the idols of her father. And it seems to be that his father is using that as an excuse for a confrontation. And he seems to also think that that excuse does not violate the warning that God gave him the previous night, which you'll notice he did choose to reveal to Jacob. He didn't have to say, your God told me not to bother you. Notice, however, he is still looking for his idols, even though he's now had an encounter with God, which is a whole nother layer of, wait, if you've just experienced God, why are you still worried about idols? Of course, you might be worried about idols because, ka-ching, they're valuable items. Let's find out.
Jacob answered Laban, saying, I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters from me by force.
All right, now, how could he possibly do that? Right? How could he take them? By law. If Jacob is held as being a slave, then during his servitude, the wife that he was given, or wives, and the children that were born to them would still belong to the master. Right? So if Jacob says, you've treated me like a slave, and everything that we've done, you've acted as though you owned me, then yeah, I thought that if I came to you and said, I want to go home, you might have let me go for the work that I've done to you, but you might still keep the rest of the family as though they were your property because of me as a slave. So there's a legitimate legal reason why in the ancient Near East, Jacob really had a concern for this. It's not just hyperbole.
But anyone with whom you find your gods shall not remain alive. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have of yours and take it. Jacob, of course, did not know that Rachel had stolen them.
All right, so he basically says, go around, see it. If you find it with anyone, I'll even execute them, right, for what they've done, because obviously he doesn't know. By the way, execution is never the penalty for theft, but he has special reasons for being hyperbolic in this sense, because he's rather upset, and he wants to show the whole world, and of course all the witnesses here that are Lavan's as well as his own, that his wealth was never stolen from Lavan. As much as Lavan tried to cheat him, he never stole anything from Lavan.
And the flocks and stuff, they're all agreeing belong to Jacob.
Legitimately, they are his.
They're all
at least
spotted.
according to the deal.
They're
Exactly.
all spotted. That's
Exactly. All right.
So
So,
Laban went into Jacob's tent and Leah's tent and the tents of the two maidservants, but he did not find them, the gods.
right. Yeah.
Leaving Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent. Rachel, meanwhile, had taken the idols and placed them in the camel cushion and sat on them. And Laban rummaged through the tent without finding them. For she said to her father, let my lord not take it amiss that I cannot rise before you, for the period of women is upon me. Thus he searched, but could not find the household idols.
All right. So she very cleverly puts them under her saddle cushion. And this is someplace that he's not going to shove his hand in to rummage around.
Right, and just to make sure.
Just to make sure, exactly. But notice that he's been fairly thorough in his search. He legitimately knows that they were stolen. And two and two together, they were stolen at the same time that the family all ran. It does kind of make sense, and he's actually right, that they were stolen by one of these people. But he's coming up empty-handed.
And I could see why he wouldn't really suspect Rachel of things sitting on them, even if she didn't say it was a time of period, because that's his daughter. He would never have thought that she would do such a thing anyway. So although he's rummaging around
He searched her sister's house.
The house, yes, but he wouldn't be going figuring that she
Yeah.
had it on her, right?
Patting them down.
That they wouldn't have done that. That was pretty clever, therefore, for her to realize that he wouldn't be doing that, just sit on it.
But do realize that he did search
He did
his
search
daughter's
But he,
tents.
But I
it
think
doesn't say that he searched Rachel's.
Yes.
No, he searched the tent.
the tent, yes.
But she's sitting there while he's looking
Right.
through everything.
But he would have thought Jacob stole it and hid it someplace.
Right, but he did check the ladies.
He did check the ladies.
Yeah.
And the two maids.
Yes.
All right, so now Jacob decides he can really bust that out.
Now Jacob became incensed and took up his grievance with Laban. Jacob spoke up and said to Laban, "What is my crime? What is my guilt that you should pursue me? You rummaged through all my things. What have you found of all your household objects? Set it here before my kinsmen and yours, and let them decide between us two."
Right, again, he's invoking this, your group has chased us down, and my group is sitting here in front of you. If you've got some argument to make before the clan, we're all here, right?
Prove it.
Prove it. Right, this is way to show to his family that he's not a cheat, and it's way to show to Lavan's family that Jacob isn't a cheat. He's got witnesses.
These 20 years I have spent in your service. Your ewes and she-goats never miscarried, nor did I feast on rams from your flock. That which was torn by beasts, I never brought to you. I myself made good the loss. You exacted it of me, whether snatched by day or snatched by night. Often scorching heat ravaged me by day, and frost by night, and sleep fled from my eyes.
Right, it's neither wind nor rain nor sleep.
Of the 20 years that I spent in your household, I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages time and again. Had not the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac been with me, you would have sent me away empty-handed. But God took notice of my plight and the toil of my hands, and he gave judgment last night.
All right, so notice that little twist of last night.
Yeah.
Right, he's reminding Lavan of the vision that he's already had, which is basically saying, look, now you've gone through all of this. If you want to keep pushing this, understand that you got a warning last night, which should, together with all the evidence of the last 20 years, tell you that God is on my side. Now, why might Lavan still be hesitant to believe this? Because he's been able to exploit this Nebuch for 20 years. Right? So how powerful is your God when I've been able to do all of this to you for 20 years? And now you're telling me, ooh, God's going to get you? Where was God 7 years ago? Where was God the first 7 years? I mean, come on. Right? And why didn't your God protect you against your brother? You could have stayed here if you'd wanted to. But he is saying, yeah, whatever you want to say about that, you got a warning. Right? Neither good nor bad are you supposed to do to me. So let's just drop it.
Then Laban spoke up and said to Jacob, "The daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All that you see is mine."
Right, which is the beginning of a really bad speech.
Yeah,
Because he's basically saying, yeah, we're really going to do this. I'm taking it all back. But
Yet, what can I do now about my daughters or the children they have borne? Come then, let us make a pact, you and I, that there may be a witness between you and me. Thereupon Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, "Gather stones." So they took stones and made a mound, and they partook of a meal there by the mound. Laban named it Yegar Sahadutha, but Jacob named it Gal-ed. And Laban declared, "This mound is a witness between you and me this day." That's why it was named Gal-ed, and it was called Mizpah, because he said, "May the Lord watch between you and me when we are out of sight of each other."
right, which is a very famous thing that has become jewelry items. You may have seen that you can buy these like medallions that have 2 halves, and they've got like little loops you can wear on a necklace. And you take one half and you give it to a friend, and you wear the other half. And it says this verse, right? It'll say this verse, that may God watch over you when we're not together. But as you can see in context, this is a threat,
Yes.
right? In
Oh,
context,
no.
this is basically saying, I may not always be there to see you, but God's watching you, and so help me if God sees you do something bad. That's actually the full intent of this verse. It's just one example of what happens when you pull things out of context.
If you ill-treat my daughters,
Mhm.
or take other wives besides my daughters, though no one else be around, remember, God himself will be a witness between you and me. And Laban said to Jacob, here is this mound, and here the pillar, which I have set up between you and me. This mound shall be witness, and this pillar shall be witness, that I am not to cross to you past this mound, and you are not to cross to me past this mound and pillar with hostile intent. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, their ancestral deities, judge between us. And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Jacob then offered up a sacrifice on the height and invited his kinsmen to partake of the meal. After the meal, they spent the night on the height.
All right. So notice that,
And the next morning, they kissed goodbye.
and then they say goodbye. So notice that Laban asks that they swear by the God of Abraham and Nahor, and Jacob, of course, says yes, by God of Abraham and Isaac. He doesn't include the other. But this whole notion of Laban's willingness to discuss Jacob's God is a little bit shocking, perhaps. Why give even lip service to Jacob's God? So we're going to look at a few comments on that, as well as his overall behavior, and then I'm hoping we're going to successfully take a tour of a number of other pieces of Tanakh with commentary that will lead us to some interesting conclusions. All right, so first, let's see about this whole, why is he making a statement about God's going to watch over you kind of thing?
A peculiar statement, seeing there were plenty of people present at the time. What Laban meant that there would be a time when none of the people who now witnessed the covenant would be available to testify if a dispute concerning whether its terms had been kept erupted.
All right, so this is true of every contractual type agreement that doesn't have a formal legal system to in perpetuity support the claims of the litigants, right? When you guys make a contract with somebody, you know that it will be available for adjudication by the American courts forever, because you've got documents, they've got documents, and we've got a whole legal system that you expect to still be there in 50 years and 100 years and 150 years that will be able to handle these sorts of claims. Back then, they didn't have that expectation, right? Who's going to adjudicate between Laban and Jacob, right? Is there a United Nations that's going to come in, an international court of justice for family disputes? No. And so what he's saying here is that, yes, we may have all of these witnesses, which, as you notice, we repeated over and over again in front of the kinsmen, in front of the kinsmen, in front of the kinsmen, but eventually those kinsmen may not be here, or they may be dead, and that means who's going to be able to hold you accountable? Because if you're only following the edict because of the living kinsmen who can come and testify, once they're no longer around, you may think you can get away with anything. But if you understand that this is underpinned by God, at least a God you respect, then we've got some confidence, right? Swearing to God is a different level of expectation, since we do expect God will still be around long after the witnesses may have passed. Onward, Radak continues.
Now that Jacob returned home, there was no one to remind him or even to report on observance or non-observance of the terms of the covenant.
Right, even more so, he's not even staying in the land where Laban lives. So why would you expect him not to take other wives or mistreat them? Who's going to know that would know about his promise not to?
This is why Laban invoked God as being the witness if the terms of the covenant were broken. He was to be the guarantor.
Right, so when I'm not around, God still is, and that is what I'm going to put my faith in, that God will make sure that you get your comeuppance if you happen to break the covenant.
What does Jacob get out of this agreement between them? Because it looks like Jacob doesn't get anything in return. It's just something.
He gets to go,
He gets to go.
and he keeps his
He gets
family.
his wives,
And he
And
full of
it's-
stuff.
children,
Right.
and the flocks.
Oh, I thought Laban was already told not to harm him, and Jacob knows about it.
Yeah, he was told that, and he'd harmed them for 20 years with impunity. So Laban might have thought, you know what?
Yeah.
What's one more warning? I'll take all the stuff back and let Jacob go on to face his brother alone and penniless, and we'll see how all that works out for him. But it does seem that Laban has gained a little respect for the God of Abraham. It does seem that he is reluctant, despite his whole, it's all mine. He is saying, but you can keep it. Now, it may act like, he may be acting like this is a great kindness that he's doing, But is it a kindness? Is it self-interest? Did he finally get faith? What's going on here with Lavan?
Well, Lavan really humiliated himself when he made this big fuss over the idols.
Yeah.
And rummaged through, and you can kind of see it in your mind as he's going through these tents and everything else. So Jacob came out looking like, I had nothing to do with it. You
Yeah.
just,
It could have gone very differently if he had found the idols.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
He's calling for the attribute of strict judgment, this attribute of strict justice
Mhm.
to be applied heavily to Jacob. He doesn't say, be free, be prosperous, be happy, have God's mercy follow you everywhere, which is a wonderful blessing to have. He's saying, may God strike you down.
It isn't exactly a whole hug moment of blessing and, may the road rise to meet your feet kind of thing. You're right.
Right.
But he still does invoke God. He does invoke, God, not just you God of Nahor. So why? Is it because he just knows that's what Jacob cares about? Does he really think that legitimately God is available? It's hard to climb into his head, which is why it's not surprising in the Talmud that the rabbis suspect that this may not be of perfect motivation.
Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, every benefit for the wicked is a disadvantage for the righteous. As it is, take heed to yourself that you speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Granted, bad, this is rightly so. But good? Why not? Learn from here that benefit to the wicked is a disadvantage to the righteous.
Okay, so what unique little twist is the Talmud doing here on this discussion of good and bad?
First, good for the bad is bad for the good.
Right,
but
which
not vice versa, right?
we'll come back to that. What it seems to be saying, however, is that for Lavan, there's an opportunity here that he may be doing, that speaking good to Jacob may be beneficial to Lavan. And that is why he's being warned not to do it. That Lavan is not allowed to benefit from this activity. It's not that he is not doing good for Jacob. He's not doing good for himself through doing good for Jacob. Right? He's not allowed to do good for himself by doing good for Jacob. He can't be self-serving even while being kind. Because if he is getting a benefit out of this, then the righteous will suffer. Right? For the good to prosper, even if you think for the wicked to prosper, even if you think the good are also benefiting, in reality they're losing. Right? That's what Yevamot is trying to say here, is that it may look like the wicked are benefiting all of us. The rising tide raises all boats, that kind of line. But imagine in the world of the sages, right? Especially Shimon bar Yochai, who had interesting encounters with the Roman government. And one of the most famous was, of course, he said, everything the Romans do is for their own good. They don't build bridges because they want people to be able to get from point A to B more easily. They build bridges so that they can collect tolls. Right? They don't build marketplaces in order to help commerce and allow more people to have more things. They make marketplaces so there'll be a place for the brothels, right? And on and on and on. And that's what ends up getting him the death sentence from the Roman government, and he has to go into hiding for years. Because he's kind of right, is that the Roman government didn't do anything that was good for good reasons. Every good thing they did was always for selfish reasons that came back to bite the righteous eventually. And that seems to be what he's saying here. And that may be why Lavan is actually doing what God said, which is he is challenging Jacob. And in the end, Jacob comes away with his freedom and everything else, and Lavan comes away with nothing. And so he was not either hurt nor benefited from this whole encounter. Instead, what we just get is a separation. So perhaps Lavan actually did what God asked. He may have played it really narrow, right down that line of not good, not bad, because he didn't end up harming Jacob, and he definitely didn't end up helping Jacob, and he didn't end up helping himself either. It just sort of works out as this sort of messy separation, but enough that...
Which you can buy as jewelry.
Which you can buy as jewelry. Yes, you can buy as jewelry. But this whole feeling, though, about his acknowledgement of God would then make more sense, because he acknowledged God, and that's why he handled it in this peculiar way. Why he didn't just say, oh, okay, everything is forgiven, I love you, here, take more. And why he didn't say, I'm attacking now, right? Because he actually was showing respect to God's command to neither do good nor bad for himself, nor Jacob in the process. Lots of talk, lots of heat, not a lot of actual fire. Make sense? Yeah.
I read in some other commentaries, you don't hear, always you hear about Lavan, but you don't hear the father of Lavan and Rachel and Leah.
Yes.
And that guy was punished, was killed,
Yes.
because he was worse than Lavan.
Yes.
So Lavan realizes the way my father worked is not good.
There's some survival problems here.
Yeah. So that's maybe another reason.
Rebecca's father, which was also Lavan's father, he quickly was, in the story of Rebecca, he's there at the very beginning, but it is Lavan that carries on the negotiations. And that's the commentary you're talking about, which is, wait, where did Rebecca's dad go? He was here just a minute ago. Oh, he dropped dead because he was a complete rotten scoundrel. Whereas Lavan is only a scoundrel. Exactly, well, more than half, but he's not totally rotten. And that glimmer is something we get in other characters as well in the Tanakh. And this is where we're going to transition to the book of Judges. So we have a selection taken from the book of Judges in chapter 3. And this is from the story of Ehud and Eglon.
The Israelites were subject to King Eglon of Moab for 18 years.
Remember, Moab is also part of our extended family. They are from the descendants of Lot's daughters.
Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up a champion for them, the Benjamite Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed man. It happened.
Which is, I always found ironic.
Yeah.
Ben-Yamin, the son of my right hand, and he is left-handed.
Left-handed.
Right. It's a little bit more blunt. That it seems there was something wrong with his right-handed. That his right hand was either withered or crippled or something that he couldn't use his right hand, not just that he preferred to use his left. And that makes more sense as we carry on with the narrative.
Right, because left-handedness was considered not a good thing.
Well, it's not just that, but we're going to see that there's a reason why being not thought of as a threat worked in Ehud's favor.
It happened that the Israelites sent tribute to King Eglon of Moab through him.
Through Ehud, right? He was the one carrying the tribute.
So Ehud made for himself a two-edged dagger, a gomed in length, which he girded on his right side under his cloak. Now,
this is where you call the worst police in history for patting people down, right? You'll know, like in all the movies, when they have the hands up, right, and they pat under the arms, right, small of the back. They pat for all the usual places for guns. Well, back here, they would have patted for the usual places for weapons. Where would you normally have a weapon? On your left-hand thigh, right? Because you draw this way. All right-handed people draw this way, and if you're not right-handed, we're not worried about you, because who's left-handed, right? It's just left-handed was not militarily advantageous, because everybody fought in shield formations, and if you're left-handed, you got your shield on the wrong side, buddy, and there's no one over here to protect you. You have to do the visualizations of all those Greek guys with shield, spear, right? Shield here is protecting me and that guy. But if there's a guy to my left of me and he's left-handed, well, I've got my spear here, he's got his spear there, and then there's a shield. Now there's a big gap in our shield wall, right? Left-handed people are no good for the military, right? It's just no. It's sorry, you're disqualified from learning how to fight, at least militarily. So this was something that is going to work to Ehud's favor. So he hides a dagger where they're not going to search him.
Right, but they're not going to right side. He presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now, Eglon was a very stout man.
Fat.
When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he dismissed the people who had conveyed the tribute. But he himself returned from Pesilim near Gilgal and said, "Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you." Eglon then thereupon commanded, "Silence!" So all those in attendance left his presence. And when Ehud approached him, he was sitting alone in his cool upper chamber.
Right, make sure we got the whole drama here, right? So Ehud leaves and he dismisses all the other people who conveyed the loot. And he comes back and he says, I've got one more thing I need to say to the king.
Ehud said, yeah.
And they go up into this chamber. They're all alone now because it's a secret message. For all he knows, there are spies in his midst, and they're just the two of them.
Ehud said, I have a message for you from God. Whereupon he rose from his seat, reaching with his left hand. Ehud drew the dagger from his right side and drove it into Eglon's belly.
Again, this would not have been seen as so threatening. A guy reaches across his body with his left hand. Right? That's not a dangerous action. This is a dangerous action. This is somebody scratching their hip, especially if their right arm was withered or in other ways not seen as being a threatening force.
And you're rather bulky.
Well, the king
Not like he was going to leap up to defend himself anyway, since he was, as you say, heavy.
The fat closed over the blade, and the hilt went in after the blade.
Right, so that's how deep his belly was, that the dagger was able to go all the way in and be swallowed up.
For he did not pull the dagger out of his belly, and the filth came out.
Right, you slice open the stuff down here, and that's actually important to the rest of the story. So it's not just a graphic detail by the author. It's important.
Rav Yehuda,
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry. The rest of the story, I forgot I cut that off to make it fit. The rest of the story is Ehud leaves and locks the door behind him, and the servants come up and they assume that Eglon, the king, must be relieving himself. And with the smell, that probably fit.
And it's quiet.
Right? So he's just taking care of nature. And it's like no one's going to tell the king that it stinks. And that gives Ehud time to escape, to gather the troops. And when they come back, they are able to destroy the Moabite army and free Israel for 80 years. Okay, so we got it so far? Okay. What was unusual in that, at least that the rabbis are going to pick up, is that Eglon stood up at the mention of God. Right? When he said, I have a message to you from God, Eglon rose. That's showing respect to God. Right? I mean, he was a Moabite king. He had subjected the Israelites to cruel occupation. But when someone mentioned God, he rose. Right? He was a scoundrel in every other possible way, but he stood up at the mention of God. So with that in mind, we will see how the rabbis are going to take that lesson.
Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, a person should always engage in Torah and mitzvot, even if not for its own sake, not for its own sake, one comes for its own sake.
All right, so this is always a long-running debate in Jewish thought, which is God wants us to do the commandments because we should want to do the commandments God has given us. Right? It's you do it because you want to do it. Don't do it because you're being forced to do it. Don't do it because you want a reward. Don't do it because you have an ulterior motive. But technically, according to Jewish philosophy, if you can't have a pure motive, you should still do it. Right? Even if you have an ulterior motive, even if the reason you want to volunteer to read Torah every week is because you like everybody shaking your hand and saying, wow, you did a great job, and that makes you feel really proudful, still do it. Because if you do the commandments with the wrong motivation, you will eventually come to do them with the right motivation. That there is a knock-on effect of doing the action that will eventually shift your way of thinking. It may take time, it may take years, but it's better to do the commandments for the wrong reason, as long as you're doing them right, than it is not to do them at all. Make sense? Okay, and we're going to have proof for this.
As in reward for the 42 offerings that Balak the wicked sacrificed, he merited and Ruth emerged from him.
Remember the Balak with Bilam, talking donkey guy, and they wanted to curse? What was Balak the king of? Moab, this country, right? So he had offered up these sacrifices to try and get Bilam to curse us, but technically they were sacrifices to God. So even though he was doing it with the wrong motivation, he is still going to be rewarded. And then he got rewarded by having Ruth.
And as Rabbi Yosei, son of Rabbi Hanina, says, Ruth was the daughter of the son of Eglon, the son of Balak, the king of Moab.
Right? And who was Ruth's dad? Eglon. The guy who was so fat and the filth and all of that, that was Ruth. That was Ruth's dad.
That was Ruth.
Mr. Fat Filth spilling out, that was Ruth's dad. And why was he the one in the chain? Because he rose before God. Right? He had no other redeeming features, but because of that, his offspring was allowed to be able to be someone like Ruth, who would join the Jewish people and, of course, become one of the line, the primary line to the King David. What do we think?
And the Mashiach.
And the Mashiach by extension, yes. No, not enough. You don't get to have kids like Ruth if you're a complete and utter slob.
Well, I don't think it was much of a
Murderous king.
First, he didn't really know what was going to be eventually with Ruth.
Right.
And what you're saying is Ruth left the Moabites and went to join Israel. Is that a reward to him? Or
Well, it's a reward for any parent to have a child grow up to be someone like Ruth.
Right.
Now, whether he recognizes
yes, he would not.
that was a reward,
Right.
whether he recognized what was so unique about his daughter, because this would have happened at the time before his daughter was married.
Yeah, I think she's also rescued from the famine in Moab at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but still, that he wouldn't have seen it as any particular reward. But we know later that was
Well,
he's held in higher esteem.
It's like Lavan, right? Was there some acknowledgement that God was God, even with all the other stuff that he was leaking into his world? I don't just mean the physical, but everything that he did as this brutal dictator. Was there some part of him that was recognizing God as God? Not fully, obviously, or else he would have let the Israelites be alone and not, brutalize them. But was there something in him, some spark? Might that be the spark that eventually would take full form in his daughter Ruth? And the same can be said of Balak, right? Balak, obviously not a good king and somebody who wanted to curse these people and all of that, but he did it through an instrument that was God, right? He was looking for God to curse them, and he knew that that's what Balaam was going to do, and he was offering sacrifices to God, believing that God would curse them because he believed God could curse them. He just got it wrong because he didn't realize that God had really, really, really meant it when he said the Israelites were not going to get cursed. But he does have some connection, some belief. It's not pure, obviously, and it's definitely not of the highest caliber. But doesn't some level of it, some recognition, doesn't that deserve at least, yay, good job, a little bit of maybe. Well, let's hear about Ruth and the story of how the story of Ruth opens. This is from the Targum. The Targum is an Aramaic translation of the book of Ruth. There's Targums of everything from the Bible, but many of the Targumim, of the translations are also blended with Midrashim. That is to say, the translator wrote in explanatory notes that are taken from the teachings of the sages. So it makes it a slightly different experience when you read it.
In the days of the judges, there was a famine in the land of Israel.
So far, the normal beginning of Ruth.
10 severe famines were decreed from heaven
Now we're in the Midrash.
to be in the world from the day of creation of the world until the time when the King Messiah shall come to chastise the inhabitants of the world. The first was of Adam, the second was of Lamech, the third was of Abraham, the fourth was of Isaac, the fifth was of Jacob, the sixth was of Boaz, who was called Ibzan the righteous. The seventh was of David, the eighth was of Elijah, the ninth of Elisha in Samaria, and the 10th will be not a famine of eating bread, nor a drought of drinking water, rather of hearing the word of prophecy from before the Lord.
All right, so that's what we mean when we say famine. Onward.
Right. Yeah, and when that famine was severe in the land of Israel, a great man from Bethlehem of Judah went out and went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Elimelech, the son of Naomi,
The husband.
The husband of Naomi died, and she was left a widow, and her 2 sons orphans. They transgressed the decree of the word of the Lord, and they took for themselves foreign wives from the house of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the second was Ruth, the daughter of Eglon, the king of Moab.
Again, not that you'll find that in the original Tanakh version of the text, but clearly the translator is trying to make sure that you read this, you understand. And before the days of writing parenthetical commentary in the margins, this was how Judaism would try to educate the masses so that they would understand more about the text than just what the Hebrew in its shorthand way shared.
And they dwelt there for a time of about 10 years. And because they had transgressed the decree of the word of the Lord and had married into foreign nations, their days were cut short. She arose, she and her daughters-in-law, and returned from the country of Moab. For it was announced in the country of Moab from the mouth of the angel that the Lord had remembered his people, the house of Israel, to give them bread because of the merit of Ibzan the judge and his prayers, which he prayed before the Lord. He was Boaz the pious.
All right, Ibzan.
Wow.
We all know him, right?
Yeah.
No,
Boaz.
not so much. We all know Boaz, but Boaz is never mentioned in the book of Judges, right? But the book of Ruth is clearly set in the time of the Judges.
Right.
And so our sages said, well, if Boaz isn't mentioned explicitly, but he was clearly this important guy, then let's see if we can find someone else to line him up with, that he might have been known by another name, which is not uncommon at all. And they struck upon Ibzan, which we're going to find in Judges 12, was indeed a judge. He only gets a little bit of screen time, so don't blink.
And after Yiftach, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel.
Notice they're in the right city,
Right.
and there's even some good consonant overlap. So we've got the reason why this might be the guy.
And he had 30 sons and 30 daughters, whom he sent abroad, and took in 30 daughters from abroad for his sons.
So the phrase that's actually used in the Judges is chutz, which probably meant in and out of the clan. That he married his children very widely throughout Israel in order to bind the clans together. That it's not that he was sending them like, to New York. That's most likely what is meant by the text for chutz that's being discussed here.
And he judged Israel 7 years. Then Ibzan died and was buried in Bethlehem.
All right. So what do we know about Ibzan? From Bethlehem, had a lot of kids, and he married them widely. Okay? That's all that you need when you're a Talmid Chacham, when you're one of the sages, to come up with a good interpretation of his life that leads to something important. Because one of the big problems right here is if this is Boaz, where were the 60 kids when Ruth showed up? And where were all the wives when Ruth showed up? Because it doesn't sound like Boaz was, living with this giant train of family. It sounds like he was a widow, childless sort of guy when she shows up.
Well, he comes across as wealthy, though.
Wealthy, definitely, and important, which is why connecting him to Ibzan as a shofet, as a judge, makes a lot of sense. But there seems to be a family missing. And we're going to explain the absence of the family, again, by going back to the Talmud.
So Rob says, Boaz prepared 120 feasts for his children, as it is stated, and he had 30 sons and 30 daughters he sent abroad, and 30 daughters he brought in from abroad for his sons. And at each and every one he made 2 feasts, one in the house of the father and one in the house of the father-in-law.
All right, makes a lot of sense, right? It's how you keep peace in the family, is by making sure there's a party for both families. Because remember, if he was sending them here and there, then that meant that he wanted to make sure there was a party both where he lived and a party wherever their kid was ending up living. Makes sense? And if the kid was moving in, they had to be a party at the home city as well as in Bethlehem. Make sense? Good. Except
Except he did not invite Manoach to any of them.
All right, now notice why are we picking on Manoach of all of a sudden? Because that's the next chapter. Right? Manoach is the very next chapter of the book of Judges after Ibzan. And therefore, the idea that there must be some connection between Ibzan and Manoach lends itself very easily. And why would Manoach not be invited?
He wasn't invited to any of them, as he said, he is a sterile mule.
Now, remember, mules are sterile,
Oh, that's right.
right?
Yeah.
Mules are sterile. They're one of the hybrids of horse and donkey that can't have babies. Right? They are born sterile. So by calling him a sterile mule, it's kind of insulting, but not as insulting as the English sounds. Because in English, we forget that mules are sterile, and we think of mule as only being like a dumb, stubborn animal. But that's probably not what was intended here. It's probably just more like he's as sterile as a mule, meaning he's never going to have kids.
So how is he going to pay me back?
Okay, because that's why you throw parties, right?
How is that?
Right? You throw parties because everybody you invite will invite you to their parties when it's their turn. And if they're not going to invite you, then why would you waste food on them?
And other people want to invite them.
Well,
Because you didn't invite them.
well, everyone else, if that is the measure, then yes, it becomes epidemic in the society. If society is only being gracious and hospitable because of reciprocity, then anyone who is presumed not to be able to reciprocate will now be treated terribly. And apparently that was the precedent that Ibzan, also known as Boaz, had been setting because of the way he treated Manoach, who, by the way, was the father of Samson, who also had some problems.
A sage taught, and all died during his lifetime. And thus the people say, why do the 60 children that you beget during your lifetime? Go to the trouble and beget one who will be more diligent than 60.
Right, so what's the point of having 60 kids if A, they may all die, and B, they may all turn out to be scoundrels? Better to have only one and focus on the one to make sure that you can not only keep them safe, but also raise them properly, which, of course, the best way to raise a kid properly is to set an example properly. And that seems to be where Boaz was slipping. So there is this interesting juxtaposition in this thread throughout these narratives of this overlapping of the way people are behaving, is sometimes the bad guys have a few saving graces and, you know, actually maybe kind of sort of give acknowledgement to God. And sometimes the good guy, in this case Boaz, had stumbled in a fairly significant way. But what was his remedy? What did Boaz do for the poor after this had happened?
Yeah, you have the gleaners.
The gleaners were absolutely brought in, and Ruth, even though she was the strangest of strangers, meaning that she was even from a different nation, was given extra portions.
An honor.
Not just an honor, but this is, in a way, a fixing of the error that he had made from what he had been doing before. So the narrative does fit together very nicely. Now, again, does that mean if you were going back and running your film cameras, this is exactly what you would see? That is never the point of these types of agadot, these types of teachings. The teaching here is meant to make you reflect. When you choose your party list, are you inviting people because you want to get invited to their parties, or are you inviting people because you just want to give them a great celebration for whatever's causing you joy? And similarly, when you see someone who is not such a nice person, do you look for the small glimmers within them that show that they do have some hope, some connection, and may eventually have some effect? Not just a kid, but even just other effects that they may lead to that is worthy and noble. And that's what we need to focus. And those are the sparks that we have to nurture and to help grow. All right. Thank you all very much.
How many wives did he Boaz?
It doesn't say in the text.
I mean, a lot to have 60 children.
Yeah, but